You are listening to the Foreign Policy Focus podcast.
We cannot wait for the final proof. The smoking gun. It could come in the form of a mushroom cloud.
Haven't you driven enough people from their homes already? Bulldoze their villages, seize their property and their laws. They had no part in making it.
Now working in Libya with friends and allies, we've demonstrated what collective action can achieve in the 21st century.
Now the host of the show, Kyle Anzalone.
This is episode 441 of the Foreign Policy Focus podcast. On today's show, I have more coverage of the Soleimani assassination and the Iranian missile strike against two Iraqi bases that house U.S. soldiers in response. Important show today, so I need you to share it. Find it online over at the Libertarian Institute. I'm also the news editor there and write the daily news roundup. Find both the show and the news roundup on the homepage over at libertarianinstitute.org. Make sure you subscribe to the show somewhere. I do 3 shows a week updating current events. And if you want to donate to the show, you do that at patreon.com/foreignpolicyfocus. Alright, so let's talk about the Iranian response. It's a missile attack. 22 short-range ballistic missiles. They say some of these missiles were capable of carrying multiple warheads. It appears 15 of those missiles were aimed at the Al-Assad air base. This is the one that Trump was ranting about last week, saying that we are going to sanction the Iraqis over if they decide to, access their sovereignty that we're always going on is so important and tell American troops to leave. Well, he's saying we spent billions of dollars on it. So that was one of the targets. They say 15 missiles were fired at it. And depending, some people say there's small to no warheads on some of the missiles. But it seems from the satellite photos that at least 5 structures at this building were hit, suggesting that, some of the missiles did hit their targets. Then another base in Iraqi Kurdistan was targeted that also houses U.S. forces. They say 7 missiles were fired at it. At least one of those missiles hit a target and satellites show damage to a structure. As of the recording of the show, nobody was killed in any of those missile attacks. It seems that no one was injured either, and this is likely because the Iranians telegraphed this attack to the Iraqi government before it happened. And it was in a discussion, apparently. The Ayatollah, the supreme leader, informed the prime minister of Iraq that this would be happening. And then the Iraqis went and informed the Americans. Now, it's important to note that both of these bases have apparently very sound fallout shelters underneath them, more than capable of withstanding probably anything Iran could throw at that base, but definitely this very light missile attack. So with prior warning and the ability for all the soldiers to get underground, it's not surprising that nobody was killed. So the reason Iran did this attack, this missile attack, was more symbolic than tactical, right? They weren't trying to cripple, U.S. military infrastructure, although they probably did. If there was anything in those buildings that were hit, they were likely destroyed. So it could have been a few $100 million worth of damage, I suppose, especially if it's like heavy equipment that's going to be difficult to get back to like Anbar province of Iraq. It could be quite expensive to replace. I have no idea what the damage assessment is. And they also didn't kill any Americans. And so it wasn't like a blood revenge scenario. You can imagine that there probably was a lot of demand for that among the hardliners in Iran and some of the Iranian people, saying, well, the U.S. unfairly assassinated our general, a very important person, to the Iranians, as well as several other Iraqis and Iranians, some of the others who are also war heroes of the ISIS fight in Iraq and Syria. But Iran resisted that and again signaled their attack before they carried it out. Now, I think in the larger scheme of things, so maybe looking at it strategically, while dangerous, it does seem like this move played out in favor of the Iranians. I mean, unfortunately, if maybe the Iraqis hadn't signaled this, you can't imagine that the Iraqis wouldn't have told the Americans, but, maybe the prime minister sits on it because he's upset with the Americans or something, and Americans end up getting killed, or for whatever reason, one of the missiles hits, a little bit off target and then ends up hitting a site that unfortunately kills or really injures someone, that, creates it puts it in a different ball game. I mean, this is dangerous. You're launching large, missiles hundreds of kilometers, with very large payloads, apparently, and some of them, you could really kill somebody. It's a reckless thing in some ways to do. At the same time, it was a very measured response and, was meant to be something that the Americans and Trump didn't have to respond to. And in fact, the night of the attack, the last word, we kind of had from the White House was they weren't going to have a press conference that night. And Trump sent out a tweet. The first 3 words were, all is good. At the same time, the Iranians were able to do something that they hadn't done before, directly launching munitions from Iran while Iraqi base, apparently American or U.S. coalition targets on that Iraqi base, is a pretty significant step. And they may feel like in some ways they were able to, really bite the big dog back and not get bitten back from that. And they probably in some ways see this as a little bit of a success. Now, anybody who is making the Trump is playing 4D chess argument here and that we're now getting de-escalation, I don't think that's right at all. And for one of the reasons, I don't think this is Iran's only response. I think this is maybe going to be the most public response, and certainly the one that probably Iran takes the most credit for publicly. Like, I guess it's possible they sink a U.S. aircraft carrier tomorrow or fire at a U.S. ship or something like that. But assuming that they don't carry out any more missile strikes, and as we saw after the attack, they said they wouldn't unless the U.S. attacked back, then it seems like this will, be the most public response from Iran. However, I think they're going to continue to work in the region to expel U.S. forces, and this whole exchange, the killing of Soleimani, and then Iran be able to fire back at U.S. bases and then not receive return fire is going to be something that I think Iran uses to build momentum to push Americans out of the Middle East. So overall, I think this tactically was a huge blunder for Trump, a major mistake, and probably a win in the region for Iran, especially when you look at what was happening in the months before, where both in Lebanon and Iraq there were protests in the streets, and while it wasn't Ayatollah go home, screw you Iranians, or anything like that, at the same time the Iranians were unwanted foreign influence in both of those countries, and the U.S. didn't seem to carry out a real regime change effort or trying to capitalize and do a color-coded revolution type protest movement with either of these. People in the Middle East were probably feeling like, well, the Iranians are the bad guys now because they seem to be pushing back against this and against, the protest movement and being an outside force that's playing like a geopolitical game here. But the killing of Soleimani changed all that. And, the Americans just said that we are, the devil that you all have said we were for years. And although in the past couple of years we slacked off a little bit, that wasn't because we've actually changed our mind on anything, and we're looking to stay out of some of this, kind of internal debates and rivalries and protests movements in these countries, especially when, they're kind of localized and grassroots and everything. We're going to enter into all these phrases and kill General Soleimani, and we are the devil that you have been protesting against all these years. Another aspect of the missile strike was the Iranian response, and here was very clear that what the Iranians were trying to do is repeat what the Americans did, made similar threats, post a picture of the Iranian flag. There were threats against any country that the U.S. launches strikes from, so they take off from a base in Iraq, the UAE, Qatar, Bahrain, etc. The U.S. would then, or Iran, says that they would then attack those countries as well. I think the strike was timed along with the about the time the strike on Soleimani, and so it seems that's the parallel Iran was trying to draw, and they were doing a symbolic strike in the memory of Soleimani. I think they actually buried the guy right after, although I think his funeral ended up getting delayed because there was a stampede, or there just this massive crowd and a bunch of people unfortunately got crushed at one of his memorials. All right, so coming back over to the U.S. for a couple minutes, I got some news, and that is the Trump administration informed Congress on their I guess, reasoning or, their claimed authority for killing Soleimani. Rand Paul and Mike Lee were standing around and got caught by some reporters after they left, or I don't know, maybe they went up to those reporters and say, hey, I got something to tell you. But they were not pleased with what the Trump administration had to tell them. Mike Lee said it was, I think, the worst briefing he had, probably the worst briefing, at least on a military issue, he had ever seen. And Rand Paul was baffled at how they were using the 2002 AUMF, which I'm very surprised that they tried to invoke to say that was their excuse for murdering Soleimani. The House will be voting on a war powers resolution that is aimed specifically at making sure Trump and the rest of the country understand that Trump does not have an authorization for war, any kind of authorization that he can invoke to wage war against Iran. Now, this seems symbolic to me, but at the same time, I don't know what else we have here other than to, take to the streets and pass a resolution. I guess one thing that Congress could do is add, an article of impeachment for abuse of power for this. I mean, that would be at least something that stings a little bit more. Again, I don't know how successful they would be in actually removing him from power from it, but I think it's a far better and more coherent argument to make to the American people why, Trump is a bad, evil guy that abuses his power rather than this Ukraine gate nonsense. Trump gave a speech the morning after, actually close to noon, the day after the strike, and basically said that the economic war against Iran that the U.S. has been waging is going to continue, but the U.S. was not going to shoot back at Iran. And so some people are calling this de-escalation, and it is a little bit, but at the same time, Trump actually announced more sanctions against Iran. I guess it sounds a little bit cartoonish at this point to believe that more sanctions against Iran are really meaningful at this point, just because so much of the Iranian economy has already been sanctioned. So depending on what those sanctions are, they may not be very impactful. But at the same time, the economic war that's being waged against Iran, started by the U.S. leaving the JCPOA, the Iran nuclear deal in May of 2018, is the reason we are where we are today. And so unless the U.S. plans on in some way ramping down that economic warfare, I don't think we're actually getting real de-escalation here. There is, in some sense, a little bit of de-escalation that, the U.S. isn't going to launch another attack against Iran, which Iran would then respond to and pretty much put us in the middle of a shooting war. But we're going to say right on the edge of that. We're taking maybe a half step back from the brink here. That's not saying very much. And, to be clear, it is the U.S. that is responsible for walking us back from the brink now. The Iranians were within the nuclear deal that they made with Obama and the U.S. in 2015, and they really never wanted nukes in the first place. But they made this deal to get sanctions relief. The U.S. agreed to it. It was, a good deal in that for anybody who was paranoid enough to think that the U.S. needed to sanction Iran because they were trying to build nuclear weapons, this would absolutely prevent Iran from making nuclear weapons. So it kind of worked to make sure, the John Boltons didn't have an excuse to exploit to, start a war with Iran. And Iran got sanctions relief. Well, the Trump administration backed out of that, even though Iran was complying with the deal. It's really, an unbelievable sequence of events, how Iran was complying with the deal and the U.S. withdrew from it. And then the U.S. calls Iran a malign actor over and over again, and gets repeated in the U.S. media. So, if Trump was really looking at de-escalation, he would be talking about sanctions relief on Iran and not putting on additional sanctions. Again, I would guess in the, coming months and throughout 2020, we will see and not see Iran take some different actions in the Middle East, that cause anti-American results. They're going to look to push the U.S. out of the Middle East. And these in a lot of ways are pro-Iranian results because, America is always, painting Iran as the boogeyman that must be defeated. Other signs and indications that things may be ticking down just a little bit too. Pence did say the U.S. has received some intel that Iran told militias not to attack U.S. forces, and Mohammad al-Sadr, a prominent Iraqi cleric and the leader, or I guess the kind of, at least behind the scenes leader of some Iraqi Shia militias called for no attacks on American forces as well. And Sadr is not the most, or actually not really an Iranian-influenced Iraqi Shia. He is more of an Iraqi nationalist. Troops continue to move around the Middle East, various countries, talking about either temporarily moving forces outside of Iraq into Kuwait, Jordan, Bahrain, other countries in the region. Not a whole lot of talk about bringing troops home, unfortunately. And so I think that's, again, another point to take against Trump's, this idea that Trump's taking or playing this 4D chess, or however many Ds you want to claim he's playing here. He's not in any way, doing anything that signals he killed Soleimani to exploit the then reaction to remove U.S. troops from the Middle East. Rather, he's sending more there. The last thing I have on today's show about Iran is this plane that crashed shortly after takeoff in Iran, just after the missile strike on the U.S. base. There's some reports, although I haven't seen any solid evidence, that it was a Iranian anti-aircraft system of some kind that took down this plane. There's also reports, and these have some evidence, at least what looks like documents behind them, that there were problems with this plane on the tarmac, and it went down because of kind of failures in maintenance. The plane went down shortly after takeoff. 170 something people were on board. All of them are dead. The most people on board were Iranians, and then there were a substantial number of Ukrainians and Canadians as well. All right, a couple other stories from the U.S. I want to mention. Congressman Duncan Hunter, who was apparently spending campaign funds on mistresses and private schools for his children. I guess he has since pleaded guilty and is looking at about 14 months. There's a really good report by ProPublica, and it's a long read, but I think it's one that's, worth it just for one of these detailed stories that explains really well why the U.S. military and empire doesn't work and why they don't care about the soldiers. So in December of 2018, you had 6 U.S. soldiers killed when 2 planes collided on a refueling training mission. Now, a report comes out on this, and it points to things like chain of command issues, like people not asking their superiors for stuff, or, making the proper request. They found Ambien in a couple people's system. Somebody was having an affair. They say the kind of the unit was running wild, and this was the problem. Now, ProPublica does this very detailed report, and it turns out that this was a unit that was deprived of the parts they needed to fly their planes, and they were not up on the training missions that they should have been, and then they were put in a position where they were flying a mission at night. They weren't given enough time to adjust to a night flight schedule, and the report describes some of the things the pilots had to do to fly the planes, which I didn't know about, but it sounds like I didn't understand why pilots needed so many flight hours in these planes to, kind of stay up and certified on it, and why you couldn't, just climb in a plane a couple years later and for the most part do the same stuff you did before, and all the different kind of muscle movements that have to go on to keep a plane flying right. And so anyways, this is a pretty dangerous mission in an environment the crew wasn't familiar with yet at night when they weren't prepared for that, and they didn't have enough training hours recently, like I think 40 or 50% under the number of training hours they should have had in the previous month, that these things had been reported up the chain of command but generally ignored. The ProPublica report also says that the guy in the unit that was having an affair had nothing to do with what happened that night, and the Ambien in the system of, I believe, the dead airmen was not any kind of level that was actually relevant, to what happened. It was just trace. So they had taken it, but they weren't high. Anyways, so it seems like the initial report that was put out really goes after the individuals involved who do seem to have made some mistakes, and, probably had they followed precautions a little bit better, maybe that mission goes better and they don't end up dying. But, kind of looking at the fact that they were deprived of what they needed and they were forced to fly these missions anyways. And I'm sure I, talked about it on the show at the time. Cause I know this story was definitely in my news roundup that, these men didn't have to die because the U.S. didn't have to be carrying out this training mission, because we don't need a world empire where we have F-18s all over the planet spread so thin, because we can never draw back from anywhere ever, or else all the terrible things in the world will happen. This is the thing. If we would leave South Korea, then the North Koreans will take over. If we leave Afghanistan, the Taliban will take over. If we leave Iraq, the Iranians will take over. If we leave Eastern Europe, the Russians will take over. And so we have to stay on these fronts all the time, and that's more strain than the military can handle. And so now every so often, some people die in training missions, and their lives aren't also often thought about in the cost of empire, but that's what it is. And again, I think this is just a really good report to read to show that. All right, so in Spain, you have the area known as Catalonia, and the people of Catalonia, they want independence. In October of 2017, they voted for independence, and the Spanish government responded, not by endorsing democracy, but going out in the street and beating old ladies with clubs and stealing ballot boxes. The Spanish government then rounded up the Catalan leadership that put together the independence vote, and has since thrown some of them in prison and is trying to get those who were able to leave Spain rather than be arrested, extradited to Spain. They face some setbacks on trying to get people extradited. However, they have successfully locked away those Catalans who fought for independence on what seems like pretty bogus charges. In Vietnam, protesters stormed a military base where some people in the military were building a wall, and the police were involved. The protesters apparently had some grenades, or at least homemade grenades, and petrol bombs, which seemed to be something like a Molotov cocktail, and were able to kill 3 police and 1 protester was killed. In Afghanistan, we have reports of scores of civilians being killed in U.S. drone strikes. Likely it was a double tap drone strike where we shoot a missile. Some people die as the rescuers rush in. We kill more. This is especially disgusting and lethal when civilians are hit the first time. So maybe you have people in rushing to try to save children's lives, and those people are then killed by the airstrike. 2 Afghan pilots, helicopter pilots, were killed when their helicopter crash landed. In northeastern Syria, 4 Turkish soldiers at a checkpoint were killed by a car bomb. It didn't say who the assailants were. I imagine, there may be some Islamic State elements operating in the region that maybe carried out this attack, or the Syrian Kurds who in some places are now being occupied by Turkish forces. Some stories in Africa. Al-Shabaab killed 3 people with a car bomb in Mogadishu. Al-Shabaab has carried out several big attacks in the past month or so, killing 90 plus people with a bomb in Mogadishu before attacking a Kenyan army base with U.S. soldiers, killing an American soldier and 2 contractors, and then carrying out an attack on a Kenyan communications mast and killing 4 children. Turkey and Russia have issued a joint statement calling for a ceasefire in Libya beginning on January 12th. While Turkey and Russia seem somewhat friendly these days, it doesn't mean they find themselves on the same side of many other regional conflicts like in Syria or in this case in Libya. We have seen Russia be able to work alongside Iran and other countries to build different ceasefire agreements between Assad and the rebel groups in Syria. So it's possible maybe they could get one of these in Libya. Recently, the LNA, the Libyan National Army leader, that's Khalifa Haftar, took Gaddafi's, the longtime ruler of Libya's hometown of Sirte, or I heard it pronounced Sirte, from the internationally recognized government, the GNA, or Government of National Accord. Sirte is a significant city to take. The U.S. fought a war there on behalf of the GNA. We used 499 bombs over the course of a couple months right at the end of 2016 to help them liberate the city from the Islamic State. In Nigeria, militants dressed as soldiers entered a town and then turned their guns on the soldiers, killing them, and then destroyed 750 homes, leaving about 1,000 people homeless. 18 UN peacekeepers were injured by mortar fire in Mali, and the U.S. has now sanctioned the vice president of South Sudan. All right, everybody, thanks for tuning into the show. I do have a new article up at the Libertarian Institute. My co-author there is Will Porter. I really enjoy working with Will. I think a lot of times my best work comes when it's a combined effort. So make sure to check out that. I'll have a link in the show notes page, and Will be on the show next week to talk about North Korea. Follow me on Twitter. I'm at KYAAALE. Check out the Facebook group Foreign Policy Focus. Find pretty much all my work at the Libertarian Institute, sometimes on the blog, featured articles, the daily news roundup, or the show. Subscribe to the show somewhere, patreon.com/foreignpolicyfocus.